Lectures on the Basics of Biblical Greek. Chapter 29. In Chapter 29, there are no new forms to learn. Rather, we learn a new function for participles. So we start this lesson with a bit of review of the present participles and the aorist participles that we have learned previously. A participle is a verbal adjective. It's built on a verb by using an unaugmented tense stem, a participle morpheme, and a case ending, with connecting vowels sometimes intervening. The present active participle consists of the present stem, a connecting vowel, nu tau as the participle morpheme, and the 3-1-3 case endings. For the present active participle, it is best to memorize these 6 forms: on, usa, on, ontos, uses, ontos. The present middle passive forms are formed by combining the present stem, a connecting vowel, the participle morpheme, mana, mene, and the 2-1-2 case endings. Here, memorizing amanos aon should be sufficient. The first aorist active participle involves a combination of the unaugmented aorist active stem plus the tense formative sigma alpha, always look for that, the participle morpheme nu tau, and the 3-1-3 case endings. For the first aorist active, it is sufficient to memorize sas, sasa, san, santos, sases, santos. The first aorist middle participle is formed similarly, except the participle morpheme is mena, mene, and the 2-1-2 endings are used. For the first aorist passive participle, the unaugmented aorist passive stem is used from the 6th principal part. The tense formative, in this case theta epsilon, plus nu tau, the participle morpheme, and the 3-1-3 case endings. Memorizing thes, thesa, then, thentos, theses, thentos will help the student recognize these forms. The second aorist active participle looks the same as the present participle except for the use of the unaugmented aorist active stem and the fact that the accent is not recessive to the tense stem. On, usa, on, ontos, uses, ontos are sufficient for recognizing the forms. The second aorist middle participle likewise is formed by the unaugmented aorist active stem plus a connecting vowel plus mena, mene plus 2-1-2. Again, very easy to recognize from the 6 main forms, from which it is necessary to memorize only amanos aon. The second aorist passive participle is formed like the first aorist passive participle, with the tense formative being an epsilon only rather than a theta epsilon. Otherwise, the forms are identical. So memorizing ace, asa, en, entos, aces, entos is sufficient. Having learned these forms in previous lessons and reviewing these forms in this lesson, we also recall that we previously learned the present and aorist adverbial participle. The present participle uses the present stem, describes continuous action. The adverbial participle has no article and conveys the circumstances under which the verbal action takes place. So the participle agrees with a noun that it modifies in case, gender, and number. If active, the word it modifies does the action. If passive, the word modified receives the action. The aorist adverbial participle is formed similarly and identified similarly, except it uses the aorist tense stems. Adverbial provides the circumstance under which the main verbal action takes place. Most students find it helpful to think of relative time when using these participles, with the present participle stressing continuous action at the same time as the main verb. Thus, the helping word often used is while. The aorist participle speaks of undefined action generally before the main verb, so the helping word after is frequently used. In particular, with the aorist participle, just adding ing it sometimes doesn't get the whole sense. Having reviewed these forms and the adverbial participles, we now turn to the adjectival use of the participle. The forms are identical, but the function is different. So we're going to start by reviewing adjectival grammar. Then we'll look at the attributive and substantival uses of the adjectival participle. We'll talk about the role of aspect. We'll give a chart for telling the difference between adverbial and adjectival participles, and focus in on the 4 key concepts that a student must know to work with participles to this point. First, a review of adjectival grammar. Since participles are verbal adjectives, it's important to remember how adjectives function. An adjective can function as an attributive, that is, providing an attribute of a noun modified. In the example ha agathos logos, the attribute of logos, or word, is the adjective good, the good word. And so, an attributive adjective agrees with the noun it modifies in case, gender, and number. But an adjective can also function as a substantive, that is, standing in the place of a noun or pronoun. Ha agathos estin, the good person is, or he agathe, the good woman. In these examples, the case comes from the function of the substantival form, the gender and number, from that for which the substantive stands. However, that for which the substantive stands, the noun, is not present in the sentence. The adjective substitutes for it. With these 2 uses in mind of an adjective, we will now notice how adjectival participles function the same way, either in an attributive sense or in a substantival sense. First, the attributive use. A participle can modify a noun and agree with it in case, gender, and number. What makes the participle adjectival, and in this usage attributive, is the presence of an article prior to the participle. Ta paidion ta legon, the speaking child, can also be done ta legon paidion. Notice in both cases the participle legon has before it an article. This article identifies the adjectival use of the participle, and the presence of a noun indicates that it's the attributive participle. Notice with such participles where the article is present, we don't use while or after. Those are for adverbial uses when there is not an article. The substantival use is similar. There is an article plus a participle, but as with a substantival adjective, so with a substantival participle, there is no noun in the clause that is modified by the participle. So, The substantival participle has an article and participle but no noun. It takes the place of a noun in a clause. The case comes from how it is used in the clause, gender and number, from that for which it stands. The one speaking to the crowd is the first example. The woman speaking to the child is the second example. In both cases, the participles of lego have an article, but they do not agree with another word in the clause. They stand by themselves. They substitute for a noun. A bit tricky in translating a substantival participle is the use of the pronoun. If the article is singular, the pronoun could be he, she, one, or that, in part depending on the gender of the article, and in part depending on the context. If the gender is feminine, it's normally she. If the gender is masculine, it can be he or one, depending on the context. In the case of the example given, to the one wishing, the toe could also be neuter. To that which wishes. When a plural article is used with a substantival participle, one typically uses they or those, or the things which, in the case of a neuter, unless the context is specific. So, hoi kalumenoi, the ones being called. Ta arkomena, the things which are beginning. Let's look at some more examples. Ex heis egenethe Jesus ha legomenos Christos, from whom was born Jesus, the one called Christ. Notice how legomenos has an article. One might think Christos is a noun with which it agrees, but in fact that's a predicate noun. So ha legomenos is a substantival use, the one called Christ. Epen to legonti auto, he spoke to the one speaking to him. To legonti is a substantival use of the participle lego. Since there is no noun that is modified, the auto is the indirect object of legonti. Pas ha akuon mu, tus logus tutus, kai me poion autus. Here, in this particular case, the article ha functions both with the first participle akuon and the second participle poion. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them, and so the sentence continues. Hoide akusantes ekaresan, and the ones who heard rejoiced. Notice in this particular case how the substantival participle has a word intervening between it and its preceding noun. That often occurs. In adverbial participles, aspect is important, with present participles stressing ongoing action and aorist participles undefined action. But in the adjectival participles, this aspect is less prominent. In fact, almost disappears in the substantival use of the participles. So we simply use the action rather than stressing whether it's present or aorist when a participle is adjectival, either attributive or substantival. We have learned that a participle is a verbal adjective. It can be either adverbial or adjectival. The key is telling the difference. The presence or lack of an article is most important. An adverbial participle is always an arthrous. It always lacks an article, while the adjectival participle is usually articulate. That is, it usually has an article in front of it. So presence or lack of an article is key, but context is also important. Which makes more sense? When there is an article, it can't be adverbial, but if the article is lacking, it's sometimes ambiguous. So try both, and whichever makes most sense is probably correct. Perhaps this chart will help. As you're reading Greek, you meet a participle. The first thing to ask is an article present? If yes, the participle is adjectival. If no, the participle is adverbial, usually. If the participle is adjectival, the next question to ask is a noun present? If a noun is present with which the participle agrees in case, gender, and number, then the participial function is attributive, like a regular adjective. But if there is no noun with which the adjectival participle agrees, then the article plus the participle functions as a substantive, as a word combination that stands in for the noun. We translate it quite frequently with a relative clause. So, in working with these participles, there are 4 key concepts one must keep in mind. Adverbial participles never have an article, and they provide the circumstances under which the main action takes place. Adjectival participles always have an article. They can either be attributive, that is, they modify a noun, or they can be substantival, when no such modified noun is present. In this lesson, we have introduced the student to adjectival participles, which can either be attributive or substantival. We have reviewed the forms, and it's a good thing, having learned these forms, to review them. But we are now moving into a new function, because a participle is a verbal adjective. It can be not only adverbial, but also adjectival.